Welcome to another round of PCL Reads with me, Amy Rosa, and Lee Smith. We are excited to announce, since the library has changed its name from Providence Community Library, which was PCL, to Community Libraries of Providence, we are also changing our name. So we will be called Communities Read, ... whatever we're doing that month. So we are so excited to be doing that change as well. Tonight, we are virtually at the Mount Pleasant Library, which is Lee's domain. And we are so excited to be able to have Patricia Rubertone here with us. And she joins us from Brown University. She's the professor of anthropology over there. And she's going to talk to us tonight about her wonderful book called Native Providence. So we're so excited to read that book. It's amazing. I love the cover too with the artwork. So wonderful. Let's see. So Professor Patricia Rubertone is the professor of anthropology at Brown University. And this is her most recent book called Native Providence, Memory, Community, and Survivance in the Northeast, which was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2020. She's also the author of Brave Undertakings, an archaeology of Roger Williams and the Narragansett Indians, and editor of Archaeologies of Placemaking, Monuments, Memories, and Engagement in Native North America. So these are some awesome other books we should check out by her. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Patricia, who's going to have such a wonderful talk for us tonight. Welcome, Patricia. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Amy, and thank you, Lee, too, for the invitation to give this talk about my new book. Before I begin talking about the book, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking from Providence, where I live, where I teach, that is within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett tribal nation. I recognize that the Narragansett people are still here and continue to live on the land that this city was built upon, as well as in other cities and towns in Rhode Island. They are part of Providence's past, present, and future. And today, as in the past, they share this landscape with indigenous people from many tribal nations, both near and far. Okay, the idea for Native Providence, for writing Native Providence, began with my research on monuments that European Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries raised to commemorate 17th century Native sachems and events. I wondered why Native people attended the dedication ceremonies of these monuments that basically inferred that they only existed in the past. I suspected that their presence was meant first to refute claims that they had vanished and to acknowledge the continuing importance of places on the landscape that European Americans built these monuments upon. Some Native people who attended these ceremonies are identified in the programs of the dedication exercises or in newspaper articles about these events. I wanted to know who they were and where they lived. After doing some preliminary research, I learned that some lived in Providence. And if there were some, I figured that there were certainly other Native people who called Providence their home in the late 19th and into the 20th century. And more than finding their names and addresses, I wanted to know their stories of survivance. What the Anishinaabe writer, Gerald Weisenor, sees as renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry, through which Native people make their presence known and defy oblivion. So here were some of my questions. I wondered if these people were born in Providence, or possibly did they move there? And if so, what were their native homelands? What routes did they take? Did they travel back and forth between the city and the countryside to visit family and friends? Did they sometimes leave when city life resulted in more disappointments than opportunities? What places did they carve for themselves in the urban landscape and fill with new experiences and memories? How did they find one another and build community? How could Providence's history be re-envisioned by inserting Native people who had largely gone unnoticed? But mostly I wanted to write about them because their lives mattered, and they still do today, to their descendants. But they should also matter to anyone who lives, works, goes to school, teaches, and visits Providence. Okay. Now, in the introduction to my book, I write about an article that appeared in the Providence Evening Bulletin on March 30th, 1943. It reported that an Indian wearing beaded trousers and moccasins and carrying a tomahawk was spotted walking down North Main Street sometime in the early morning hours by the public relations officer for Rhode Island's Council of Defense. Remember, this was wartime. This was during World War II. And when the officer told his co-workers and friends about what he had seen, they didn't believe him until a high school student wrote to the newspaper saying, the Indian seen coming along North Main Street last Saturday was Chief Sunset on his way to the Rhode Island School of Design's action class, where he went through some characteristic motions for the students' benefit. Right? So this was a drawing class and he was the model. Chief Sunset was Edward Michael. He was not a phantom. He had lived in Providence for almost 60 years. Yet as an Indian, he was not supposed to be there. Dressed in full regalia and carrying a tomahawk, he fulfilled white European Americans' broad cultural expectations of what an Indian looked like in the distant past. But he clashed with modern surroundings. Even more incredulous, he was not only an Indian, but he was a real Narragansett too, since Native people called by that name had been declared extinct by the Rhode Island General Assembly for almost as long, if not longer, than Edward Michael had resided in Providence. So simply stated, he could not be Indian and modern. To be both was contradictory. To be urban as well was even more incongruous because it confounded expectations, broad expectations about being Indian and about cities. All right. Now, throughout the Northeast, the most rapidly urbanizing section of the United States by the mid-19th century, urban histories rarely mention living indigenous people. Basically, and I'm going to use the term Indians, they appear in the writings of early European colonists as welcoming the newcomers, and then they disappear in colonial narratives about what was considered to be their inevitable decline. They occasionally reappear in anecdotes or in interviews and as archaeological evidence unearthed in construction as urban development accelerated. And they might come into view again sometime in the 1950s, after World War II, because of Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation programs that were aimed at assimilating Native people into urban life. Right? Consequently, what is said about Native people in cities in the Northeast from urban histories is very little, okay? They are barely seen and their histories are vastly undertold. Yet they were woven into the fabric of modern cities more than has been acknowledged by the minor roles that were relegated to them. They were dispossessed from the land that Northeast cities were built upon, except for ancestral places that they tenaciously held on to. Those who moved here carved new spaces for themselves and their families in what was the emerging landscapes of Northeast cities, including Providence. Providence experienced unprecedented growth during the 19th century, both from foreign immigration and from migration from its surrounding rural hinterlands. And within the stream of people, these rural to urban migrants were Native people who came from communities in southern New England whose tribal status had been terminated between the late 1860s and 1880. Many of them moved into the region's towns and cities to find work and to start new lives for themselves. Some of them decades before their legal status as members of an Indian tribe had been taken away and their land either sold outright or divided into individual holdings or allotments. Taking different routes to Providence from their ancestral homelands, they really reconfigured the social and geographical boundaries of what we think of as New England Indian country, which really extended, far beyond the reservations which were located in the countryside. In Providence, they created what I call urban homelands. These were places of long and enduring residence where they were joined together by family, by work, and a sense of community based on shared experiences, while continuing to be linked to the people and places they left behind. These urban homelands were not ethnically homogeneous enclaves, but were instead localities with a visible Native presence that was underobserved by history writers and official record keepers. Okay. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, okay, Providence was one of the chief Indian residential cities in the United States, with 173 Indians. Only Muskogee, Oklahoma, and greater New York City had more Native residents, all right? So in my book, I write about the Native people who were identified in this 1910 federal census, and those who lived in Providence a few decades before and a few decades after. I write about them in a way that focuses on their lives, their lived experiences, on the assumption that there is not one, or has there ever been, a single or one-size-fits-all urban Indian experience, but instead many. So rather than simply challenging the assumption that Native people were absent, that there were none in Providence or very few, which was not an easy task in itself, my aim was to craft what I think of as character-rich, deeply human stories about ordinary people who mostly were unnoticed, or if they were noticed at all, were pitied and oftentimes despised. So the main body of the book is organized into 7 chapters. Each chapter focuses on a particular homeland, on the reasoning that, people might say that they live in a certain city, but actually people live in more limited stretches of urban space, or what we tend to think of as neighborhoods. Okay? So neighborhoods are actually one of the true universals of urban life, from the very earliest towns of antiquity that are studied by archaeologists, as well as being very characteristic of modern cities. Okay? And this particular, I'm going to call it a spatial lens, focusing in on, honing in on neighborhoods, provided me with insights to the places where people, conducted their day-to-day lives. These are places where they lived, where they worked, where they socialized, and where they worshiped, right? So the stories of the individuals, the Native individuals and families that I write about are very place-based, okay? But before I could write about their lives, I had to first identify them and then locate them on the Providence landscape. Okay? As I mentioned, finding Native people in the records wasn't easy. Why do I say that? Census, for example, notoriously misidentify and undercount Native people, but they probably misidentify and undercount people who are non-Native as well, right? Knowing surnames was important. I needed a place to start. And I was able to identify surnames by looking at some other official documents. For example, these detribalization reports that were published by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs that was appointed, I believe, by the General Assembly. And these reports date, the ones that I started working with, dated to 1879 and 1880. I also looked at a survey of Massachusetts Indians from 1861, right? I also looked at Narragansett Dawn, which was a monthly magazine that was published by the Narragansett from 1935 through 1936. Okay, so these 3 documents, and that, for example, provided me with names, okay? Names were a starting point in searching yet other documents and sorting through the kind of subjectivity and politics of racial classification that typically resulted in Native people being judged by their skin color or their manner of dress, on the logic that if an individual's appearance did not match kind of broad cultural expectations based on descriptions by early colonists such as Roger Williams, then how could a person possibly be called Native, or to use the term that appeared in the censuses from the 19th and early 20th centuries, how could they be called Indian? And you have to remember at this time, that determination was made by the census taker. Whereas today, when we fill out census forms, we self-identify, all right? That being said, this category of Indian wasn't always an option for census takers, let alone was a tribal name. Instead, there were categories, Black, mulatto, white, colored, and colored was a generic term for people of color, regardless if that person was indigenous, African American, or both, or belonged to some other non-white racial category. Right? Often, the racial classification of the same Native person was different across different census schedules, right? Identifying addresses was also challenging, okay? Addresses were only recorded in federal censuses starting in 1880, right? And I was interested in the period before 1880, from about the time of Providence's incorporation in 1832, all right? So I had to look to other records to find where people lived. City directories were published beginning in 1832. And basically, they listed people, typically only the heads of households. And those were very useful. But city directories are limited. They identify heads of households. They provide an address. They might indicate whether the person rented or owned the house, but they didn't provide information on who else might have lived in a household. They don't provide information on age, place of birth, ethnicity, or where people were born, right? So I am going to share with you in a minute a map. So one of the things I did once I had names and once I had addresses was to, plot these on a map. And mapping was crucially important to situating Native people in the geography of Providence and telling their place-based stories. And what this mapping did was reveal that these addresses were clustered, okay? And these discrete clusters of addresses were what I then called their urban homelands. Okay, so let me see if I could do this. Okay, could you all see that map? Each point on the map was symbolized, each address is symbolized by a different character, all right? Which might be a little bit hard to see, okay? And each of those symbols or points represents a street address within a particular urban homeland. Some of them are clustered in Fox Point, others in Lippet Hill, which is more or less the Mount Hope area. Upper South Providence in the vicinity of Classical High School. Others are in Lower South Providence. There's another homeland within on Federal Hill, Mashpog Pond, and I also included Johnston. Most of these addresses were multi-family houses that were occupied by more than one Native household. All right, so I'm going to exit here. Okay. Okay. So what about their stories? Okay. The content of each chapter are the stories of Native people's experiences. Okay. And to learn about those stories meant I had to grapple with still other sources. Okay. Their homes, after all, were not just points on a map, but were multifaceted places. There were places where babies were born and sometimes died too soon. They were places where children were raised and sent off to school in the morning. They were places where women took in other people's laundry and hung it to dry in their yards. There were places where men recuperated after accidents that kept them away from work. They were places where children were nursed through outbreaks of tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, and influenza. There were places where gardens were tended, and they were places where friends and family from other Providence homelands and from distant ancestral homelands often visited. Now, I combed through all sorts of documents, deeds, wills, probates, petitions, court records, military lists, maritime logs, newspapers, and the occasional diary, in addition to the city directories that I mentioned, the censuses, and vital records, in other words, birth, death, and marriage records. And I worked with these records at major archives, like the Providence City Archives, the Rhode Island State Archives, and the Rhode Island Historical Society, just to name a few. Each record offered a path to yet another record in the hopes of learning more about these Native people's lives, okay? The research project often took unexpected turns that led to new routes of inquiry, but admittedly, sometimes resulted in dead ends, right? Meaning I could only learn so much. I also drew on the resources of town libraries, local historical societies, municipal agencies, indigenous and anthropological museums, and special collections held by colleges and universities, including Brown University's herbarium. These archives, these smaller archives, are typically ones that are off the beaten track of most researchers because their collections are not considered as valuable as those in major archives. Yet, these so-called minor institutions were invaluable to my research. Their newspaper clippings, announcements, letters, and other miscellaneous information provided me with unexpected insights about Native people's lives, but also about archival practices that have reinforced the separation of indigenous from modern urban history. And here I want to give a shout out to the Providence community libraries, okay? The Providence Public Library, the Cranston Central and Oakland Lawn Libraries, and the Miriam Moore Library in Johnston. Not in the least, my research also involved conversations with living Native people who generously shared with me photographs, their family histories, and so forth. I also visited as many places as I was writing about as I could. Houses, the houses where people lived, the churches that they attended, places where they worked, where they gathered, for powwows. Why did I do this? To get a sense of what these spaces might have looked like in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, for anthropologists like myself, field work that engages with place is central to our research. It gives insights that no archives, big or small, can do in isolation. My travels across the city took me away from my comfort zone on the East Side to visit these streets where people lived. And what I found is that as much as I wanted to get a sense of place, what their homes were like, what their streets were like, what their neighborhoods were like, many of these spaces have been re-envisioned. They have been repurposed. Okay. Some of the native houses that I visited, for example, some of them are still standing, and their facades appeared to be relatively intact. Others were remodeled with aluminum siding, storm doors, and awnings, or they were boarded up awaiting gentrification. Many of them, however, had been demolished by urban renewal and highway construction, or by continuing processes of destruction that tend to sweep away old buildings, even perfectly good ones, to make room for new buildings. Churches, for example, the Pond Street Baptist Church, that was located at the corner of Angle and Pond Streets in Upper South Providence, was a place where Native people from different tribal nations worshiped and gathered. It was no longer standing. It had been razed in the sometime early in the 1960s. As was the Second Methodist Meeting House that was located at Chestnut and Clifford Streets. And this was an important church because William Apes, a Pequot activist, speaker, and writer, preached there in the 1820s. At Mashpog Pond, which was a site of Native occupation from at least the 17th century, and certainly and probably earlier, there were signs that were posted that warned against fishing in its polluted water because of risks to health and well-being. After several unsuccessful attempts, I managed to visit Hipsy's Rock in Johnston. And Hipsy's Rock is important because it was considered a landmark that denoted the northeast boundary of Providence in early records. But across from Hipsy's Rock was a place where Native people gathered for powwows in the 1930s. But when I visited, that powwow ground which was located on a local farm, was now covered with suburban style houses, right? So basically what I did was had to toggle different strands of evidence together. There was the archival evidence, okay? There was the oral evidence, the stories that were told to me by indigenous people who had, stewarded this knowledge, for generations. There was the material evidence, what I observed on my visits to different sites, okay? These different strands of evidence were crucial to uncovering the experiences of Native people, okay? That were ignored in written histories of 19th and early 20th century Providence. Yet these people were here. Many of them were full and long-term residents who made, journeys from their tribal reserves and off-reservation homes to create new lives for themselves in Providence. Some had been here all along. Their roots to Providence ran much deeper. Providence was a place where their children were born. Okay. Their children's children were born. There were generations that were here. They found each other, Native people found each other along the waterfront, train tracks, along busy intersections, along narrow side streets, close to the residence of the city's political, business, and social leaders. They found each other in factory complexes where they worked, and they found each other at urban ponds where they went to fish, where they went to collect blueberries. Family ties were typically maintained in transit to the city and in relocations within the city. Native people lived close to other family members. Extended kin often occupied the same house or apartment or were near neighbors, as were other Native families and individuals. Whether their home was rented or owned, they stayed within a few blocks or even at the same address for years or decades, suggesting a level of residential stability that's not usually associated with indigenous people's city living. They met at churches where they discussed what citizenship meant for them, and they prepared for activism outside the church's walls. They gathered at powwow grounds and other venues throughout the city to socialize, to talk about things that mattered to them. Many maintained relationships with individuals who still resided either on or near their tribal reservations or in off-reservation enclaves. Some left the city, some left Providence when the disappointments of urban life became too intolerable, only to move back to the city because of economic opportunities or because their ties to Native Providence were as strong or perhaps even stronger than their ties to other places. The choices they made about where to live in the city, their decisions to return after leaving, and their interactions with each other and non-natives speaks volumes about being indigenous in Providence. When their voices can be heard in an occasional memoir or diary, They comment on the city's sights and sounds that some considered more comforting than the desolation that they felt in the countryside. Those who left Providence to escape discrimination and the sometimes demeaning jobs that they were obliged to take expressed loneliness when they crossed waters and crossed worlds to go to far-flung places. Among them was the sculptor Nancy Elizabeth Prophet, who moved to Paris in the 1920s and lived there for about a dozen years, only to return to the States and eventually back to Providence. The Native people that I write about experience disappointment, satisfaction, doubt, and I guess every emotion in between in an urban landscape where they belonged as much, if not more than anyone else. I'm going to take a little bit of time now to read, how are we doing on time? One excerpt from the book. And it's about a woman named Anstress Nichols, who traced her Narragansett ancestry through her mother and grandmother. She was born in Providence around 1800. She lived in a house at number 5 Thayer Street in Fox Point that her husband had purchased. It was where she raised her 2 surviving children after his untimely death. And it was a house that she managed to hold on to as a widow by taking in other people's laundry. The part I'm going to read picks up when her daughter, who had moved back to the Thayer Street home at the end of the Civil War, died. Okay. Within the next few years, the home life that Anstress Nichols had tenaciously struggled to preserve in Fox Point would again be shattered when her daughter died. Harriet's death was a profound personal loss, as the death of a child at any age would be to a parent, especially one preceded by the pain and suffering associated with the terminal disease. But there is also another kind of emotional toll that Harriet's death took on Anstress. Her death led to the loss of material things that Harriet had brought into the Thayer Street home they shared that had to be sold to cover the cost of the funeral and other expenses. These things were not merely indices of Harriet's conspicuous consumption. They spoke of her educational opportunities and professional achievements. She was a music teacher. And in no small way of Anstress's parenting skills. Their sale took away material expressions, not only of the family's social aspirations, but also these women's experiences in the home that had enabled and nurtured them. Having acted in ways that staunchly defied the mutedness of Native women and all women of color in the 19th century America, Anstress, alone, elderly, and in declining health, could no longer maintain or hold on to the home at 5 Thayer Street that had been such an integral part of her identity and survivance. In 1885, she finally left her Fox Point neighborhood, which records suggest she had rarely strayed from for any extended period of time. Okay, I'm going to sum things up here with just a few final thoughts. Like histories of other contemporary cities, Native Providence is an unfinished history. There are indigenous people who I couldn't say much about, whose names are included with those who I did write about in an appendix at the end of the book. There are also people that I probably missed. My hope is that the uncertainties of the translations, cultural translations that I've done of past lives, of past Native lives, will hopefully open spaces for telling yet other stories of Native survivance in Providence, and unsettle what we think we know about this city's indigenous histories and presence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That was a wonderful talk. If you hear noises in the background, that's him. At this time, we invite people. We're gonna go through the chat and have people ask questions. We love to be very informal here at PCL Reads and as interactive as possible. I'm sorry, community reads. It's gonna take a while to get used to that. So first in the chat is Quimmy. Quimmy, would you like to unmute and ask Patricia your question?
Yes, sure. I would like to ask you, hi, what is the role of the media in relation to Native communities?
What is the role of the media in relation to Native communities? That's a tough one to answer. I think recently, in the last, I don't know, few years, the Providence Journal, for example, has been interviewing. Instead of writing about Indigenous people, they've been interviewing Indigenous people so that they could tell their own stories. And I think, those series that really focus on the idea that Indigenous people are still here are very important to raising awareness, okay, of more broadly speaking, Rhode Island's Indigenous community and things that are going on regarding, Native people. Programs that they are educational programs, for example, ones that are offered by the Tamaquag Museum, all right? So people are aware of initiatives that are going on. They're learning about Narragansett culture from the Narragansett people themselves.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next we have Richa. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. So first of all, Professor Rubertone, this was excellent. I have always been interested in the Indigenous history, so this was really good. I was just wondering if you referred to them as Indian people earlier in your lecture. Is there an anthropological reason for that? Because I know the whole Columbus story and why they're called Indians.
Right,
but,
right.
And my second part of the question is, have you done any comparative studies between the Rhode Island Indigenous people and the Indigenous people in other countries, like maybe Australia or Spain or even Latin America?
Okay. Let me start with that problematic term, Indian. My understanding is that Indigenous people, if you're going to use a generic term, they prefer being called, they prefer the term Indigenous.
Right.
What's preferable to that is to identify them by their tribal names: Narragansett, Pequot, Mohegan. for
Yes.
example, Wampanoag. My own research has focused on the Narragansett Bay area. All right, so my research is largely focused on the Narragansett.
Okay.
So I haven't done any firsthand comparative research about other indigenous groups. So I do touch on that in my teaching.
Thank you. Are your lectures open to the community at Brown?
No, they're not.
Okay. Just thought I'll ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Victoria, you put a couple comments in there. Would you like to unmute and chat?
I mean, thank you so much, Dr. Rubertone, for your work and for raising awareness of the history of the community we live in Providence, and the fact that indigenous people are very much still here. There was just some back and forth. I did share a resource for folks, nativeland.ca. So at the beginning of her talk, Dr. Rubertone did a land acknowledgement, and so this website is commonly used to identify whose lands we're on. So for folks who may be interested in learning a little bit more about that, when you put in your zip code or where you live, it tells you the native homelands, and it also links you to the websites of those, so that you can learn a little bit more about their history and the activities that they're on, and any efforts that they're working on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing a resource. Next up, we have Amy. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hello, Dr. Rubertone.
Hi.
I was curious about, I know that with this study that you are primarily identifying the presence of these populations, and so perhaps this is a question for your future research, but I was wondering, excuse me, to what extent you were able to determine whether the populations who were in the urban environment were replicating previous family or settlement patterns, maybe possibly based on clans, once that they came to Providence. And I was also curious about how the oral histories, if you could go into more detail about how the oral histories shaped your understanding of the archival and material research that you did.
Okay, let me start with the first question, part of your question. And I think one of the important findings of my research that I talk about in the book is how family ties were maintained over space, right? Sometimes, families moved together. Families that were based in the southwestern part of Rhode Island or over the border in Connecticut moved together. They made stops along the way, but they wound up in Providence. That was their destination. Individuals who might have, moved on their own, found places to live with their relatives who were already in Providence. So there was this remarkable maintenance, of families staying together, of family ties that were maintained over space and over time. And in addition to that, the Native people who moved to Providence would still remain connected to families and friends in the places that they had moved from. So there was a lot of interaction, from the towns, from the reserves, or as we call them in New England, or reservations, and people who are living in the city. So that was the answer to the first part of your question. Could you repeat the second part?
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you could go into greater detail about how the oral histories you did shaped your interpretation of the archival and material research that you did.
Okay, that's a great question. It might take some time to answer it, so I'll give you the abbreviated version. Some of the oral histories that I worked with were gathered by my late colleague, William Simmons. And I drew on those oral histories that, helped me understand, I think, how those stories were adapted to the Providence landscape, okay? How they might have thought about ponds, how they might have thought about places where different things in their lives, occurred. And then there were the stories that were told to me by interlocutors, some of the Native people who I, had these conversations with. And these were, insights about, for example, where they would, where young people, teenagers would go and, gather and socialize. Places, where they would get ice cream, on a summer night. Places, where they would go, to cool off. Again, during the summertime.
Thank you very much. So their understanding of their presence in the landscape and how they'd interacted with the landscape, regardless of whether they were in rural or urban areas. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. That was very interesting. Great question about the oral histories. Right, let's see. So the next person wanted me to ask the question for them. Joanne asked, will you say more about the numbers of quote unquote Indians in Providence that you cited? Did I hear you right with the numbers 173? I don't understand how this could be one of the chief residential cities.
Okay. Part of that is understanding that Native people were misidentified in the censuses, okay? They were identified often as anything but quote unquote Indian. They were undercounted, right? So even places that were known to have a large urban Native population, and we're going back to the first decade of the 20th century, the numbers still seem rather small to us. And that's because, again, Native people were undercounted, they were misidentified.
All right, thank you. So we have, and then we'll finish up. We have two comments. Patricia Robb noted that for a fun library fact, William Simmons was a member of the Providence Public Library Board of Trustees and president of the board around 2007, 2009 or so. Mm-hmm. Oh, and actually, Patricia, you had a question too. Did you want to unmute? And then you'll be our last question.
First of all, before the question, I'm really very impressed with the amount of archival research you did. I know how hard that is and how slow it is. And to have gone through so many sources, I'm surprised that you aren't in your 70s or 80s by the time you published it.
Well, this was 10 years of work.
Well, it could have been a lot more. I think I read in your book that some people self-identified as quote unquote Indian and sometimes as Negroes in other times. Did you find this to be fairly common or infrequent?
No, it was fairly common. Let me backtrack here a bit. Indigenous people in southern New England had intermarried with people of other ethnicities. They'd intermarried with African Americans. They had intermarried with Europeans, right? And, you know, because of this intermarriage, if you want to describe it as that, you know, it affected their skin color. But skin color, you know, doesn't define a person's culture, right? So I think there's more to your question. Yeah, it was fairly common. Men had died, Native men had died in war. Some of them were whalers, and they would be away on whaling expeditions for a year or two at a time. Some of them died at sea. And many of the, you know, households were led, you know, by women. Women were the heads of the households. And they had, you know, married, you know, men of African-American men, European-American men. And I don't have the numbers, but I think, you know, in addition to, you know, this practice of Native women marrying non-Native men, you also had Native men who were marrying non-Native women, but probably not as frequently.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just Judith is requesting a part 2 presentation that we put on with you, Patricia. So maybe we'll think about that as well. And you're receiving a lot of thank yous in the chat, so we'll make sure to forward those along. Yeah. Thank you again for your presentation. Before everyone runs away, I just want to let everyone know that next month we'll be virtually traveling to the Fox Point Library to do a cozy mystery book discussion called The Silence of the Library. So that will be a fun book. And that's actually next week. It's Tuesday, May 3rd. But it is a quick read, so something to read over the weekend for any of you who want to join us in on that one. Again, thank you so much, Patricia, for your talk. Thank you, Lee, for inviting Patricia, and thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, and I thank you, Lee, and for the invitation. Thank you, Amy, for moderating, and thank you everyone who tuned in this evening.
Bye, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye.